Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Kevin Hains of giffgaff about his experiences using time response measures to learn more about how customers connect with the company brand.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell. Thanks for listening to Understanding Consumer Neuroscience. Today, my guest is Kevin Hains, who is the head of insight for giffgaff, which I believe is a telco in the UK. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here, and it's great to be having the conversation.
For those who don't know what giffgaff is, what's a giffgaff?
What is a giffgaff? Giffgaff is a mobile company, a connectivity company, a telecoms company, if you will. We were founded sort of about 14 years ago with the idea of really doing things differently in an industry that perhaps takes consumers for granted a little bit.
Telcos? Boy, oh boy. Yeah. Between them and airlines, like what are the companies that people are the most annoyed by and yet need?
Yeah, it's essential.
Yeah.
You know, we're a critical service, and I think, you know, people need to be connected. It's important to be able to phone your loved ones. There are emergencies. There's, you know, just important news and exciting news to tell each other.
There's Candy Crush. Yeah.
Exactly. There's Candy Crush. There are levels to be completed and prizes.
There are levels to be completed.
Yeah, prizes to be won. So, you know, giffgaff was founded off this idea of doing things a bit differently, and ultimately putting members, we call our lovely consumers and customers, we call them members because they're part of something a bit more special.
Well, and I noticed this point about 70% of your phones in 2023 were refurbs.
Yes.
Which is really an interesting idea because we know perfectly well in the tech industry, these phones are fine. Like if you put a new LiPo battery into them, they'll keep going.
Yeah.
And they're inexpensive once they've got a few years on them as well.
Yeah.
So you don't have to keep buying that, you know, 1,000-pound phone every 2 years.
No. And, you know, that's really important to us, you know, thinking about how to be sustainable, how to, you know, enable our members to not only get great value, but to do their bit for the world. And so one of the things I think we're particularly proud of at giffgaff is that we're an accredited B Corp. So, you know, we've really committed, legally committed to doing right by people, planet, and profit. So it's quite a big commitment for us to have made, really, as an organization.
But it sounds like you're wearing the things of how do you do telco better, and it is being a B Corp. You know, really building an infrastructure that says these things can be done sustainably. We can try and be a positive part of it. It must draw a particular clientele as well.
It does, and I think that's, you know, we have incredible love for the brand and for the business, and people. It sort of goes back to why I said we talk about our members. They're part of something special, right. And when I talk to them, or, you know, people in the business talk to our members, they are really big fans of, you know, because we do offer something special. We listen. And we really hear them, and we hear their problems, and we act on that. And that's one of the other benefits of being perhaps a little bit smaller than some of our big competitors. Is there's that really ability to respond to concerns that our members have, and the features or the products or the surprising things that they'd like to see and hear from us. So there's been sort of many examples. If you sort of look up giffgaff and see the many things we've done across the years, lots of examples of us just helping members and just listening to members, which is really important to us.
I like the term "we're up to good."
Yeah. And that's really what founded, you know, the idea of becoming B Corp accredited and putting that energy into that B Corp accreditation. We were doing a lot of good anyway. And when you talk to anybody in the business, there's a lot of, you know, the main thing people talk about is, I just want to do good. I want to do the right thing. I want to do what's right for members. And so that culminated into this idea, this bigger idea of been up to good, which is just really fantastic to be part of, and, an exciting place to be.
Because you've been in the insight business, and I'm looking at your LinkedIn here for probably more than a decade. And when the term insight has been in your title for a variety of different companies as is insight management. When you say the word insight, what do you mean? What does it mean to you?
Me, it's insight is, I think, a mixture of inspiration and talking truth to power. And I think it's incumbent on people within insight and anybody who works within the insight world. I think it's important that we have the bravery to speak the truth, to be objective, and to tell the business as it is, because sometimes we have to talk about quite difficult, we have to have difficult conversations about what members or customers think about the brand, or think about the business, think about the products that we're selling. And it's important that we're that voice in the business.
Mm-hmm. Do you see insight as sort of the inbound side of marketing? That, marketing is us trying to sell out a message about our brand and our product and our ideas.
Yeah. And
then insight is, how did the customer receive that?
How the customer received that, how future customers might receive that, and how can we tap into future audiences, I think is, and that's the other part of it, is not only do we have to talk truth to the business, but we also have to inspire the business to change, and we have to inspire the business to think differently, do things differently as well. So in some ways we do have to sell our wares and sell our ideas into the business to be that catalyst for change.
Inbound marketing, you are marketing to the company to more align with a prospective set of customers.
Absolutely.
And this sort of brings this idea of what a brand's really about then. How do you define brand? I mean, we always talk about it on the show, but I don't know that we really dig into. So what is a brand?
I would never, ever imagine that I could give a good answer.
That's fair.
There are so many people who are so much smarter than me. But to me personally, I think it really does boil down to a set of feelings and a set of ideas that something stands for, that you want to adopt into your life, that perhaps says more than just the functional use of that product, but perhaps sends some messages both to yourself and to the people around you about what sort of person you are. And so I think that's what a brand is. It's very intangible.
It is, isn't it?
The more I work on brand strategy and brand building brands, the more I realize it's really just a feeling.
That ultimately our customers have some relationship with our product, some set of feelings around that product. And in some ways, the brand is a artifice between the actual product and the customer to trigger those feelings.
Yes, absolutely.
Like I think about a logo and a name for that matter as all elements of the brand that trigger the relationship to the product.
Absolutely. I think it's every part of the brand that you can touch, see, taste, feel, consume in some way. They all contribute to this bigger idea that is the brand. And what's exciting and really fascinating is getting under the skin of how all of those different touch points, if you call them that, what do those touch points mean to people? Right. How do they recognize those touch points? I think is fascinating.
So now I feel like there's two things I need to know. The first is how people actually feel about the product, and then how the brand equates to the product. Like they're not necessarily the same thing. Like I might have a product people really like, but I haven't built good enough branding around it to associate that brand with the product.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example, a good challenge or good conversation around, particularly for small brands. Because often, in the start, if you're a startup or you're just sort of starting your business and creating this product and you're beginning to sell it, it is really hard to convince people of all of the aspects of it, and to give people a sense of to build a brand around a product when people don't know about it or who you are. They're not even aware of you. It's incredibly challenging.
Sure. And
I think for small brands, you look to the big brands, the well-known, the brands that have been here for, decades and decades, the big multinational brands, and you look at them with envy because you just think they just have to flash a color.
Yeah.
And everybody knows what that brand is.
And some of those products are only sugary water, and they're still widely recognized and somehow beloved.
Yeah.
It's very strange to think in terms of, I don't know how important that product actually is, but its people's association with that product and that brand are extraordinary.
It's the complexity of how our minds perceive the real world is just fascinating. And I remember many decades ago, and on another continent, I remember changing the label for a really well-known soft drink brand, and consumers would tell us they would argue with us until they were black and blue that we had changed the product. And you sort of go, no. Wow.
Because all you've done is change the label.
The label has just changed. We've just updated the label, made it look, I'm sure there was a better strategy, but effectively we just made it a bit cooler, but bit more relevant for younger audiences. And all of a sudden there was this huge backlash because people were like, "You've changed the product, you've added, you've reduced the sugar content, you've added sweeteners, it tastes different,
or something." And you knew perfectly well exactly the same product in the container, but
yeah.
I'm also fascinated by the idea of customers defending a product against its owner. Like, listen, you are betraying this product you own. The customer has its own relationship with the product.
So I guess, I'm sure lots of your listeners will know sort of New Coke, those examples.
Very famous.
There are so many.
Yeah.
There's so many examples of products that have, been tweaked or changed, label change, a formulation change that was well intentioned.
Yeah.
But, you sort of, when you eat and drink that product or use that product day in and day out, you just it's familiar.
Yeah.
And you don't want that trust betrayed.
Yeah. The idea that there's a trust, first we have to perceive the fact that there is a trust in there that could be betrayed by tweaking the product. I think about insight, this idea of just communicating to the product owner, your customers trust this product to be a particular way, tread at your peril. Understand the consequences of trying to alter that. And then in a recognition that maybe the alteration is necessary, how do you do this in the least painful way? Like, do you simply take the blows and people will get over it? Or is there a community strategy to come to people want to try the new version? And the new Coke story is interesting because, in some ways Coca-Cola was very open about the fact of we are changing the formula and so forth. And sure, there was an outcry and both products sat side by side for some time. I don't know that we look back on that and say that was a brilliant strategy by Coke. It certainly got a lot of people talking, and it's not like they sold less in the end.
But the saying, there's no such thing as bad PR.
Yeah, something like that.
I'm sure I hear my PR. I can hear my PR colleagues recoiling as I say that. But
I'm also thinking that was the 80s. We're in a different era now, where I think people are starting to really feel we're super saturated in PR, and so there is such a thing as bad PR now. Dude, don't ask for people's attention if it's not for good purpose, because attention's gotten so valuable.
It really has. That is probably the fragmentation. I guess we would talk about the fragmentation of media and all the communication messages that people are being bombarded with across so many different touch points and media types that it is definitely getting harder and harder to grab people's attention and hold people's attention.
Sure.
Which is a particular challenge for brand building, because you're trying to tell people these, a lot of brands and a lot of products have complex stories to tell. And I can, almost every product I've worked on has had a really, really fascinating production process, history, And you sort of, when you sit in the marketing department and you think, what can we actually tell people? You sort of go, well, we've got to think about how much attention.
Yeah. How much time have we got? The story can't be too complicated. Most people are busy.
We can't make a 2-hour documentary about our brand.
Well, you can, but nobody's going to watch it.
Well,
you're going to spend a lot of money.
Exactly. So it's a unique challenge. But I thought I'd go back to kind of, we were talking about trust and building trust. And that's an interesting, not breaking trust with consumers. And that's quite often, I think what happens in the insight world is we sort of see those risks and those opportunities of the intangible feeling around a brand. And that is an interesting challenge because that's, sometimes there are changes to be made to a product which are financially beneficial for the business, or maybe to meet regulatory standards, or there are loads and loads of reasons that these products change, or just to update it and sort of maintain relevance with new audiences.
Right.
And one of the questions I will get quite often asked is, Kevin, what's the risk of us making this change?
Yeah. There's a bunch of things we could change, and many of them we change, nobody would notice. Everything is fine. But there's a few landmines out there. Like, how do you go about identifying the things that people really value about your product?
Yeah. So how do you quantify trust? How do you quantify familiarity? How do you quantify the right color, and whether that changing that color is going to make a difference? I think one of the most common questions I've been asked through all my career is, Kevin, how much has our pack design change made?
Right.
How many sales?
We know how much we spent redoing this label.
We do.
How does that translate into sales? How
many more did we sell just because of that design?
Yeah.
And so that is a uniquely challenging question to answer. These intangibles, these really difficult to measure, they're emotions, they're feelings. How do you measure that? And
is this where neuroscience comes into play?
It does. It's got a big role to play.
You've done this work, right? You've worked with Cloud Army in a variety of different entities, giffgaff, I presume, being one of them. What do you try to measure then when you're trying to quantify that trust? Well,
we try and as best as possible using neuroscience techniques and working with the fantastic consultants at Cloud Army. We try and measure these intangibles. We try and measure whether or not people do trust a product. And that is all down to how strongly they associate your product with that feeling, that color, that logo. There's so many, that sound. And I think that's a particularly interesting area, is the sort of sonic branding.
Yeah, sonic branding.
But these are the intangibles that I think really only, neuroscience-based research can really help us understand, because I think asking somebody explicitly and saying,
we've learned from surveying that asking people why they like a brand is just not a good idea. You do not get usable results from that.
No.
So you have to measure it obliquely. Do you like the sort of time response type tests?
Yeah.
Do you get insight from that?
Loads. And I think that's where particularly these more intangible aspects, because quite often if you do ask explicitly, most of the responses will sort of gravitate around the same levels, So, if we ask, does this famous brand, do you recognize this color from this famous brand? Most people will say yes.
Yeah.
And there's no way to differentiate that.
No.
But what the timed response is really fascinating when you start to see, well, how quickly do people recognize that color with that brand? It becomes really fascinating to sort of see how that pulls apart. Because when people don't necessarily have that, they don't have the considered time like an explicit survey would allow them to. And you sort of, I guess we're sneakily watching them in the background to see how quickly they answer.
Well, we're getting those subconscious responses. Like when they when the brand is really in their minds, those responses are almost instantaneous. It's shocking how fast it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when it isn't, it's apparent. Like there's a clear delineation in the data.
And I think another area that is, so obviously with brand building, absolutely relevant, but I think where this is uniquely interesting is there are a lot of topics and a lot of questions that businesses ask about their customers and consumers that are difficult to ask explicitly. Only because people will quite often give you the response that they think they should give you.
Right. The pleasing effect.
Yeah. And I sort of give the example of recycling, and it's really that say do gap that I'm talking about.
Sure.
And if you said if you sent a survey out and said, do you recycle?
Everybody's going to say yes.
Everybody says yes, because they feel like I should be recycling. I must be recycling.
I must have recycled something. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's one of those where I think when you ask it explicitly, it's hard to get a genuine response. And timed response and implicit responses are a fantastic way to give us greater insight into that subconscious and greater insight into what they're actually doing versus what they think they should be saying to us.
You talk about the color of a label, any of those sorts of things. We've had conversation on the show before about changing packaging, impacting the ability for the customer to find it on the shelf.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. We generally live in an overwhelming range of choice in our average grocery, at least in the West. So, product identification is important. But you seem to be pressing more on the emotional response, that when I change that packaging, I don't elicit the same response. Like, have I effectively broken the brand at that moment if I do that?
Potentially. There's always an interesting debate about there are things you can do to make your brand shout louder, be noisier,
right?
Stand out more. But there's a balance to be struck with. You're trying to build something. You're trying to build an idea and a set of emotions and a set of feelings around your brand as well, because that's what creates long-term sustainability. Sure. If all we were trying to do is shout, you just run, promotions are a great way to do that.
Yeah. But people move away from the barker eventually, right? Like you can only take so much noise.
Yeah. And everyone, you've got to create a sustainable brand, and creating that feeling is sort of really the route to sort of building that relationship with your consumers that is just so much more valuable than that one-off sale.
Sure.
It's about creating a long-term relationship with those consumers so that they learn and they trust you, they learn more about you, they get more involved in your brand and more engaged, and equally you can learn more about them as they stay with the brand. And that sort of ties back to, and I think why I really love giffgaff, because there's this real idea of mutuality, and that's really what giffgaff means. It's a sort of an old Scottish word, and it's about this idea of mutuality, that as much as you give us as customers, we give back to you, be that through value for money or better products and services. But I think it's really, really true. The more you build this long-term sustainable relationship with your customers and your consumers, it just helps to build a really, really powerful brand, which is really fascinating. Yeah,
you're also striking on an idea that this relationship evolves, that people don't fully understand your product when they buy it the first time, that it's going to take time for you to communicate a longer message. It's a telco. There's not a box on the shelf per se. Like, I think that's really an interesting problem to go over to. Most people, when they take out their phone, don't think about their carrier. Like that's not the thing that they're looking at. So when do they even think about you? The monthly bill? Is that it?
So it is the sort of classic category entry points, that sort of phrase of, what are the moments that people are going to be thinking about their mobile carrier. And it's not always when you pick up your phone, but it's when, it's when the call doesn't go through, when the message doesn't quite, you don't get the blue ticks. When that communication fails, they will think about their mobile provider at that point. So for us, it's about managing that relationship, because it can be a very high risk relationship.
Sure.
Because we are such a critical service really for people. More and more people don't even have landlines, phones in their homes anymore.
This is their connection.
They just use their phones, their mobile phones. So there are those moments, but there are the other moments which are, they want to buy a new device. Mm-hmm. They want to buy a new handset, a new phone.
That's the logical time to think about, is it time to also change the carrier?
Yeah. There are these other moments where they will think about us, but that is the risk for us, is that we can be sat, like many utilities, we can be the moment the bill arrives, we can be the moment the service fails. So managing that, I guess that's why we're so passionate about building that relationship with consumers and really understanding them and giving them a sense that they've got a voice into our business.
I don't know how you collect insight on those moments. That seems like a really challenging thing to do. Again, I keep falling back to classical surveys. Like, when you consider replacing your phone, what do you think about? I don't know how you turn that into a timed response measurement to sort of get the workflow of how someone chooses to change a carrier.
It's very challenging. And I think this is where we will use a mixture of methods to understand our consumers. I think quite often where timed response and where implicit work becomes really powerful in particular is actually in understanding how to respond to those moments.
Right.
The communications we can send, the reassurances we can send, the solutions we can provide at those critical moments. So I think often we can quite easily understand a lot of these moments and where the risks are, but it's more about how we respond. And that's where timed response and sort of going really into the subconscious, because what we want to make sure is that we respond in a reassuring way,
right,
in a way that consumers and our members would expect us to respond.
Or your prospective members. Somebody's on another carrier, they're ready to replace their phone, or they're frustrated once again, or they got the wrong bill. Like, this seems like an SEO problem. Like, I want the right search terms at that moment when they're frustrated, that my product appears saying, I have a better way for you.
And we spend a lot of time thinking about help and support and how we can ensure that it's easy and simple and people get the solution they want,
right,
quickly and easily. And it's a unique challenge for giffgaff because we only provide digital support. We don't really have a call center. You sort of have to interact with us through digital channels to get support. And we find incredible success because we take the savings from not having a call center and we sort of give those savings back to our members through good value tariffs. But it creates a unique challenge for us because we don't necessarily have a reassuring voice at the end of a phone line for people to talk to.
I think you're also the product of the time too, because there's a non-trivial number of customers today who really don't want to talk to anyone. If you can answer all their questions online and they can interact with the device successfully, they're probably happier too.
Yeah. And we see incredible success. We use obviously sort of the very, typical traditional digital channels that you would expect, great website support and lots of help articles. But what's unique about giffgaff is there's this community that people can tap into. It's almost like a little mini Reddit,
right?
Where you can go in and you can have conversations and
so this is customers helping customers.
It is.
That's pretty
so
cool.
Our members will help you, and they'll respond pretty quickly. So you'll get a response almost immediately from our other members who are there to help and this is kind of goes back to what I said earlier. There's this real fan base around the brand. It's a really loved brand, and we've built something incredibly unique around that, which is quite exciting.
Did the powers that be discover this community per se, or did they make it? Was this intentional, or did you realize when we do the right things, this community emerges? Like, I don't know how someone listening to this goes, oh, I need to make one of those.
It's really fascinating because I think it was partially intentional, but I don't think anybody really imagined it would get as big and as powerful as it is today.
You can't say on the surface, hey, I want my tech support to come from the customers helping other customers. Like, that seems absurd. And yet it sounds like that's what has emerged at giffgaff.
Pretty much did. That's kind of, but it was based on this idea of, we will take the savings. We're not going to develop a great big call center that's going to cost us a lot of money to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to start small. And we're going to let customers help customers, or as I should say, members help members. Giving
a place for that to occur.
Yeah.
But that's as much as you can really do.
Yeah. But we built a community. And that's what's key is that it was never, and I'm sure there may be lots of inside professionals listening to this. It wasn't a research community.
Mm-hmm.
It was in some ways used for research and to understand members, but it was bigger than that. It was this idea of creating a community.
Mm-hmm.
And these people who would help you would also have conversations with the business and people in the business about how they wanted to shape the product. And so it was this idea of not just that, we can save loads of money by not employing a call center. That was almost a sort of a side effect. The idea was we wanted to create a product that was centered around members,
right,
and put them at the heart, and they were driving the development.
So give them a place to communicate, which I mean, imagine you initially thinking will help with all these communications, and then that community emerged from that. So by you exposed yourself, you give a place for the customers to talk to you, and in that, a community emerged.
That's hard to replicate.
Sure.
That's hard to copy.
It seems like something you could wreck easily, like
hard to make, you could, yeah,
easy to destroy.
It is, but also I think where it's powerful is that because those members have had that hand in building giffgaff, I guess we're given a fair amount of leeway to get it wrong, because we've always been open and transparent,
sure,
and we have admitted when we've got it wrong.
Well, what more powerful force in there than showing your customers you're affected by their experience and by their reaction?
Yeah.
When you can point to and say, you have said, and so we have done.
And so we have built trust because we've allowed ourselves to be vulnerable
mm-hmm.
with our members. I think people understand that, and this has pervaded a lot of the research I've done over all the years and the brands that I've worked on, mm-hmm. It's often more surprising how forgiving customers can actually be if you tell them the truth, if you're transparent.
If you show you can listen to them and act on them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Because they understand that you're a business. They understand that you're there you've got salaries and wages to pay.
Mm-hmm.
They understand you've got suppliers to pay. Customers understand how business works. They understand what you're there for. And they understand maintenance needs to happen. But it's all around the communication. But if you sort of try and pull the wool over their eyes, that's when they get angry.
Sure.
And I think giffgaff was really, really good at, and today we still are good. We are vulnerable. We admit when we make mistakes. We talk to our members. We're just really, really member centric. But
then we still need these other measurement tools that are not direct communication, like the timed response stuff. Like I think I always fear that these neuroscience pieces feel like trickery, like I'm fooling a customer or I'm pulling something they don't own. And I know it's not true, that really what this is sometimes these things are very hard to communicate, and timed responses are a better way to communicate them.
Absolutely. And even there, we will co-create research programs with our members.
Interesting.
We'll tell them what we're doing. We explain it to them,
mm-hmm.
because again, that's part of not just, thinking about them, putting them first. And we don't ever want to be manipulating people. But timed response is, and we will talk to members about it's an incredibly powerful way for us to get a genuine response, to help us get over people post-rationalizing. thoughts and feelings, and it's to get that instantaneous feeling that the reaction to something. So I think there are different ways that you can manage that, but I don't think I've ever sort of found it to be manipulative or problematic.
No, and I think when you use a term like neuroscience for certain folks, that just seems threatening. But I also think you can explain it to people in a way that says, look, we want to measure those visceral responses. And in some ways, it's like, it's easier for you to take this test than to come up with complicated answers to things you may or not thought through in the first place.
Exactly. And it's fun. I think when I look at the traditional surveys that we sometimes do, there are a lot of effort to work through.
There's almost a gamification to it, right?
It is. Yeah. It's gamified.
Yeah. But in a way that plugs into people's more visceral responses. So easier to do and actually better results, which is interesting.
Yeah.
We can get those two together when it's done properly.
Yes. And it's crucial to give us that insight into those questions that we just would struggle to get a genuine response if we asked explicitly.
Sure.
So it's very, very powerful.
I think that's powerful insight, Kevin. I really appreciate that because it helps set that stage for, we can be totally open with our customers. So how we're trying to help them, even using these more complicated tools.
And with people within the business as well, because as you say, neuroscience can, I think quite often the word neuroscience just conjures up this idea of like electrodes and caps, and
which is, a part of neuroscience, just not the whole thing.
Not all of it. But it doesn't have, and I think it's sort of just that, labs in white coats kind of, which just feels very invasive, but actually it can be fun. It can be quite engaging. It can, and it kind of, and ultimately it helps us to create better products and really understand what our product,
things that people value.
I think,
and help to communicate more easily.
Yeah. But it's a critical for product innovation, for helping us to create better products, new products. It's very, very exciting.
Absolutely. Kevin Hains, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate these insights. It's a great way to think about why we do the things we do and how we can interact with communities at a deeper level. I think what you've built at giffgaff seems extraordinary.
Thanks, Richard. It's been lovely to chat to you. And we hope we can continue to make giffgaff bigger and better and spread the love with more and more members.
A telco that people like? I think it's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
We'll get there.
Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you next time on Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.